Israel just touched something it should have left alone. Not Iranian, not Palestinian, Russian. The old saying is true. The one who swings the axe forgets quickly, but the one who bleeds, never. Israel thought this moment would pass. They thought Russia would look away. They were wrong. Russia does not forget. Russia does not forgive. And for the first time in this war, consequences are no longer coming. They have already begun. Days ago, while the world focused on Gaza and Lebanon, Israel launched a strike. The target, Iranian naval infrastructure. Nothing new there, but the location was different. The target was inside the port of Anzali on the Caspian Sea. You need to understand what Anzali is. It is not just another Iranian port. Anzali is the single most important logistical bridge between Iran and Russia. Russian ships dock there. Russian cargo transfers there. Russian grain moves through there to feed markets across the region. Russian military supplies transit through that same corridor. Israel bombed a port where Russian vessels sit, where Russian commerce flows, where Russian interests live. And they expected Russia to do nothing. Here's what the Western media will never tell you. The United States did not participate in this strike. Washington kept its distance. Why? Because even the White House knew, touch that corridor and you are not touching Iran anymore. You are touching Russia. Israel did what America itself was afraid to do. That is not strength. That is recklessness. What Israel just did is the geopolitical equivalent of Ukraine attacking Crimea. Is Iran Russian territory? No. But Anzali is a bridge that connects Russia to Iran, to the Caspian, to the north-south trade corridor that Moscow has spent years and billions building specifically to evade Western sanctions. The Kremlin invested enormously in that route. Netanyahu decided to strike it anyway. They say the cargo included weapons. I do not doubt it. Russia supplies arms to Iran just as America supplies bombs to Israel. The logic is identical. The difference is that Anzali is also a grain port. Russian food moves through there. And food is not just commerce. Food is power. Netanyahu thought he was severing Russia's drone supply line to Iran. Simple, he thought. A clean strike, then back to normal. But Russia is not Iran. Russia is not Palestine. Striking a location where Russia has operational, economic, and military interests is qualitatively different from anything Israel has done before in this conflict. Israel had never crossed that particular line. Until now, Russia's response arrived faster than Israel expected, and the language was unusually severe. Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson for Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, someone exceptionally close to Putin, issued a formal declaration. When she speaks in this register, it is as though Putin himself wrote the words. She said Israel's attack was reckless and irresponsible. She issued a formal warning that these actions will expand the conflict. She said Russia will not stand with its arms folded. And she stated explicitly that this conflict will expand toward the states of the Caspian Sea. Let me repeat that. She said the conflict will expand toward the states of the Caspian Sea. Who are those states? Russia is one of them. This was not a personal opinion. This was a formal statement from the Russian state declaring that Israel's attack directly affects Russia's economic and military interests, particularly its food commerce with Iran, and that Russia will not forgive it. Not even the United States had dared to touch that corridor. Yet Israel did. Now ask yourself why the Western media has barely reported any of this. In Russian media, Iranian media, Turkish and Chinese coverage, it appears prominently. Here, silence. That silence is not accidental. It is because this story does not fit the dominant narrative. And that failure to report is one of the most consequential failures of our public discourse. What Zakharova issued was in essence an ultimatum from Putin to Israel. Its substance is simple. Continue doing this and you will drag all the countries of the Caspian Sea into this conflict. Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, two nations that export massively to global markets and depend on that sea as their primary commercial artery. That is what Israel is putting at risk. The Caspian is not an open sea. It is technically a closed lake enclosed by Russia, Iran, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia has been extraordinarily protective of that zone. The Caspian was a zone of peace, of tacit cooperation among its littoral states. No one interfered there. No one disturbed that equilibrium, until Israel decided to launch a strike into that space. The Israeli attack on Anzali occurred at a considerable distance from the recognized zone of conflict near the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. This was not collateral damage. This was not a missile that lost its course. It was a deliberate strike against a zone that is, geopolitically speaking, the sovereign domain of the Caspian states. Israel is not one of those states. Any external military operation in that space is considered a direct violation of the understanding that has governed the region for decades. Israel understood this, and it acted anyway. Netanyahu cannot claim ignorance. He knew exactly what Anzali represents. And that decision reveals something important about the current state of Israeli strategic calculation. There is a willingness to disregard all red lines, including those that directly border on Russian interests. Here's the truth Israel miscalculated. Israel lacks the real capacity to destroy Anzali permanently. Satellite imagery shows a port with kilometers of docks, grain warehouses, container terminals, and joint military installations with Iran. An airstrike can damage buildings. It can destroy some ships, including Russian ships, but it cannot render an entire port inoperable. It cannot close Anzali. And even if it could, Iran and Russia have other ports on the Caspian. The Caspian Sea is enormous. Israel cannot strike all of those points simultaneously. So what is the real objective? Not the destruction of logistics. The objective is to send a message to the Kremlin and maintain pressure on Iran. But in that calculation, Israel is not measuring the consequences correctly. Because if the attack had directly damaged a Russian vessel, if it had caused Russian casualties on the ground, we would already be speaking in entirely different terms. Escalation with unpredictable consequences. Israel knows that, and it did not care enough to stop at the line. Here is the context the media will never give you. Months ago, Russia offered Iran a mutual defense treaty following the same model it signed with North Korea. A treaty establishing that if one party is attacked, the other is obligated to intervene militarily. Under that framework, North Korea already operates beneath the Russian nuclear umbrella. That is why North Korean soldiers have appeared fighting alongside Russian troops. Russia extended that same level of commitment to Iran, and Iran said no. A faction within the Iranian parliament that still believed in the possibility of an agreement with the West rejected the offer. They preferred to maintain some distance from Moscow. Not to be completely bound to the Russian sphere, not to owe the Kremlin that kind of debt. Now, Israel is showing Iran exactly what that decision has cost them. Iran today stands without formal protection, exposed to Israeli attacks, while Russia observes without any legal obligation to respond until Israel touched the Caspian Sea. That is what changed the equation. Israel knows Iran does not have a nuclear umbrella. It knows Russia has no legal obligation to defend Iran because no mutual defense treaty exists. It knows it can strike Iranian installations without triggering an automatic Russian military response. And that is precisely what it has been doing. But by attacking Anzali, it moved into different terrain. Terrain where Russian interests are directly engaged, where Russian infrastructure exists, where Russian assets are genuinely at stake. If Israel continues attacking Russian interests, Russia does not need to enter the conflict directly. It is sufficient for Russia to say to Iran, here is the armament, do with it what you will. Supplies, technology, not necessarily the most advanced generation. There are many ways Russia can respond without firing a single missile from Russian territory. Russia can close Syrian airspace to Israeli aircraft. It has not done that yet. Despite Israel's constant bombardments in Syria, Russia can deliver its most advanced anti-aircraft systems to Hezbollah, S-300 systems, that would render northern Israel practically inoperable. That is already a plausible reality. At a more extreme level, if tensions continue to escalate, Russia could begin delivering missile technology to Iran through undeclared channels. I confess I am somewhat surprised that has not already occurred, given that Iran rejected the Mutual Defense Pact. But after these attacks on the Caspian, I am convinced that Iran will turn back to Russia and sign that treaty. I am certain of it. There is a north-south corridor connecting the Indian Ocean to the Caspian Sea and onto northern Europe, one of the most important alternative commercial routes in the world. Any disruption of that corridor would harm Europe enormously. The Caspian represents one of the very few zones where Russian and European interests genuinely coincide. Any escalation among the Caspian states will directly affect the flow of oil and gas upon which European economies depend. That is why Zakharova spoke of consequences for all the Caspian states, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, nations that export massively to global markets and use that sea as their primary commercial artery. What we are observing in Israel is not an act of strength, it is an act of desperation. The myth of the invincible Israeli military has shattered in Gaza and Lebanon and the Red Sea. Gaza has become a genuine quagmire. Israeli casualties continue to mount. The Israeli economy is in decline. The deterrent capacity they sold to the world for so long, the celebrated Iron Dome, is no longer presented as infallible. The same pattern is repeating with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israel is inflicting a brutal toll. But Lebanon has also caused Israel significant losses and demonstrated that northern Israel is deeply vulnerable. The Houthis in Yemen have effectively closed the Red Sea to Israeli interests. And now Israel has opened a conflict in the Caspian. Israel has methodically generated conflicts across every significant maritime corridor in front: the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, and now the Caspian Sea. Through every route, through every front, through every direct attack from Iran that has penetrated supposedly impenetrable defenses. What Israel is doing now is attacking supply chains with the consequence that it is enclosing itself within a ring of its own making. The price of those actions is not paid by Israel alone. It is paid by every country in the Persian Gulf. It is paid by all of Europe, which depends on the energy transit of the Gulf for its economic sustenance. When a country possessing nuclear weapons begins attacking installations belonging to a country that possesses many more nuclear weapons, one must be very clear about who is who on that board. The country with the greatest number of nuclear warheads in the world is Russia. The second is the United States. Israel has nuclear warheads, but not a third of what Russia possesses. Not a third. The calculation being made in Jerusalem is profoundly mistaken. The assumption in Jerusalem was that they could maintain a safe distance from Russia while doing in the Caspian what they routinely do in the Middle East, what they so casually call mowing the grass. No, they were wrong. That is not how Russian geopolitics functions. For the Kremlin, there is no mowing the grass and starting fresh the next morning. Alliances are signed or they do not exist. The collateral consequence for Israel is this: Iran will now seek the alliance Russia proposed. The very alliance Iran rejected. That is going to happen. One day, when least expected, those S-300 systems will appear in Lebanon. When that occurs, you will remember this conversation, because it is precisely on account of these attacks on the Caspian Sea that Zakharova declared clearly, "Continue on this path, and you will bring all the Caspian states, including Russia, down upon you." When those systems arrive in Lebanon, the primitive rockets will be a memory of a simpler time. That is the scenario Israel is constructing with every reckless action. That is what they are provoking with every strike that crosses another line. Russia will not enter this war directly. Do not expect that. What Russia will do is sell or even gift arms to Lebanon, if only to keep Israel occupied on that front so that it does not carry the war further toward the Caspian. The logic is internally consistent and strategically sound. Great powers remain great powers precisely because they act in the service of their interests. The problem here is that Israel is now touching Russian interests. That is an entirely different story from anything that came before. If you do not touch Russia, Russia was not going to intervene to save anyone. That is the reality of geopolitics, a reality I have observed across decades of watching how nations actually behave. The moment Israel decided to cross that line in the Caspian, it changed the fundamental nature of its relationship with Moscow. And those consequences are only beginning to unfold. If you have stayed with me through this entire analysis, I ask you to share this video. Give it a like, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, your city, your country. Your location tells me this conversation is reaching the places it must reach.